think back, way back, to the fall of 2004, October. 1 month before the presidential election, 37 months after 3,000 Americans were murdered on 9/11. Memories of that awful day were still vivid and raw. Fear lingered in the air. And John Kerry gave an interview to the New York Times Magazine. He was asked, what would it take for Americans to feel safe again? He talked about how the country had thought about terrorism before 9/11, about his past work as a prosecutor, about balancing the aggressive pursuit of dangerous criminals with our basic values and way of life. We have to get back to the place we were, Kerry said, where terrorists are not the focus of our lives, but they're a nuisance. It was a thoughtful response. It was also a gift to his Republican opponents.
First, Kerry said defeating terrorism was really more about law enforcement and intelligence than a strong military operation. More about law enforcement than a strong military. Now Kerry says we have to get back to the place where terrorists are a nuisance, like gambling and prostitution. We're never going to end them. Terrorism, a nuisance. How can Kerry protect us when he doesn't understand the threat?
I'm George W. Bush, and I approve this message.
It is against this backdrop, the grief that John Kerry took for talking about a day when there'd no longer be a global war on terror and the political price he paid for it. It's against this backdrop that what Barack Obama said at the National Defense University on Thursday was so remarkable.
America's at a crossroads. We must define the nature and scope of this struggle, or else it will define us. We have to be mindful of James Madison's warning that no nation could preserve its freedom in the midst of continual warfare. Neither I nor any president can promise the total defeat of terror. We will never erase the evil that lies in the hearts of some human beings, nor stamp out every danger to our open society. Our systematic effort to dismantle terrorist organizations must continue. But this war, like all wars, must end. That's what history advises. That's what our democracy demands.
In his speech, the president grappled with the counterterrorism actions he has taken since 2009, with the innocent lives claimed by drone attacks and the ill will generated in the countries where those attacks have taken place, with the hunger strike that inmates at Guantanamo are now staging, with the civil liberties that have been compromised in the name of national security. It was a speech that laid out a vision for how America should think about and respond to the threat of terrorism as 9/11 fades further into the past. It was not a speech that satisfied many critics of the president's counterterrorism policies. And we'll get into that in a minute. But after more than a decade of open-ended war, the speech does represent an unmistakable turning point toward the kind of future that John Kerry talked about all those years ago. A future the country wasn't quite ready to think about back then, but is now. I want to bring in Kyron Skinner, a former foreign policy advisor to Mitt Romney, director of the Center for International Relations and Politics at Carnegie Mellon University, and a fellow at the Hoover Institution. Michael Hastings, author of the ebook Panic 2012, the sublime and terrifying inside story of Obama's final campaign, and a writer for BuzzFeed.com and Rolling Stone magazine. Omar Farah, a staff attorney with the Guantanamo Global Justice Initiative at the Center for Constitutional Rights. MSNBC contributor Perry Bacon, political editor for our sister website, Grio.com. So, look, obviously a ton to get into in what Obama said on Thursday. But it did strike me that, you know, we've had basically an open-ended war for more than a decade now on al-Qaeda, and the parameters of that war have widened, have been unclear, and you have a president now who is talking about, you know, a world where that war doesn't exist anymore, and where counterterrorism becomes much more the responsibility of law enforcement, of intelligence, where, you know, the CIA's involved more in espionage than sort of the drone attacks and all this. It does seem like we hit a turning point here this week.
I'm not really sure that we did. You were right to play the clip by Kerry, because I think he is kind of settling that score for the Democrat Party, that much of what we've seen from the Republican side, global war on terror, may in fact be law enforcement from a Democrat point of view. But there was a lot of George W. Bush in that speech as well. He's moved so much more to the center. He was hinting at the idea that we're in a long-term ideological struggle in a way that he'd not talked about radical Islam before. He didn't use those terms, but he was moving in that direction. So I think it was an unbalanced speech in the sense that he was on the one side saying, let's talk more about the law enforcement side, congressional oversight, and closing Guantanamo Bay, but at the same time, this goes well beyond Al-Qaeda. So he didn't really lay out a strategy as so much put forth in academic debate and he kind of said, I'm trying to figure out where I'm going. But where he's going, to me, will take him away from his liberal base because he was leaning toward the ideological long-term struggle.
Well, that's what was part of what was so interesting about watching it was he was kind of going through his thought process out loud.
Absolutely.
And you were kind of witnessing that in a way that you talk about a lot of George W. Bush there. We could talk about parallels or whatever. I never saw George W. Bush give a speech where he conceded that, these decisions aren't that simple.
Speechwriters. He had better speechwriters at this time. I don't know what happened to the first two speechwriters, but certainly they weren't working on this speech. I mean, this speech, in my view, if you compare this speech to his the speech he gave in Cairo in 2009 or his Nobel Prize speech, you see a kind of almost total rejection of the civil rights tradition that President Obama supposedly came out of, a total rejection of any kind of these ideas of a kind of peaceful transition, of a kind of trying to work with the fellow people in different nations, and just an embrace of total militarism. And the reason I say this is because that speech to me was essentially agreeing with President Bush and Vice President Cheney that we're in this sort of neoconservative paradigm, that we're at war with a jihadist threat that actually is not a nuisance, but the most important threat we're facing today. It is in my view, a complete rejection of what John Kerry said, and I said an embrace of militarism.
He's talking about.
He says that multiple things.
Right. No, I agree. I agree. It's complex, but I mean.
It's not only complex, but he enshrined. Look, the two key things that I took away from that speech is that Obama has enshrined the two most radical principles of the Bush doctrine. The first is, he sort of got rid of torture and sort of got rid of extraordinary rendition, but enshrines targeted assassination. At the same time, he doesn't apologize for. He won't apologize for the scandal in Benghazi. He won't apologize for the IRS is a few bad apples, and he says no, the AP and spying on journalists is okay. So he enshrines killing people and spying on journalists as the two major tenets of his national security state. I think this is outrageous.
I don't agree with what Michael said. I'm just to be blunt about it.
I read your piece. It was essentially, talking points from the White House. It was stenography. And I mean, look, I dig your work, and I've read it in the past as a colleague, but I was not impressed with the piece that we were sent around by the producers.
Well, let's let Perry explain what he said before we say we're not impressed with it. Let's hear it.
Well, I can say it. I read it.
Well, let's hear it first.
I guess, well, I'll go into detail here. There were two parts of that speech, I thought. There was one where the president was trying to redefine where the war on terror is going. It's winding down. He's trying to talk about drones. The part that I didn't agree with you in terms of comparing it to Bush was I thought the speech showed a lot of ambiguity about the president's views about it, which is not
exactly.
George W. Bush didn't have a lot of ambiguity about the war on terror. This is a speech very much about he's trying to sort of talking out loud, as Steve said. Here are my views. He kept saying over and over again, this is a just war, but it should be limited. We should look at ways to wind it down, change it. It basically just he doesn't like the drone program himself, is what I sort of heard in the speech. While the policy, I agree with you, has not changed that much. But there was certainly ambiguity about it. There was certainly sort of a weariness about the policy itself that I think was important to note here.
This is also after 4 years of not only escalating the war in Afghanistan, where he sent 150,000 troops. So he did try the whole occupation thing, but he also exponentially increased the number of drone strikes. He's defending murdering an American 2 years later. I mean, there's an absurdity to this whole discussion.
Yeah, and look, I keep saying there's a lot here. And there's a lot in the speech, and he definitely has escalated drone attacks. We also have the drone attack, the numbers are coming down. That doesn't mean that he has ruled them out, and we can talk about that. But one thing that I think is a change in Omar that he laid out in this speech was a real clear commitment to shut down Guantanamo. And I know we've heard that before, but he laid out, he has talked about assigning somebody from the Defense Department now to handle transfers. The sort of moratorium the administration put in place on transferring people to Yemen has now been lifted. It seems like there has been real movement on Guantanamo.
Look, I was at the prison on April 30th when he made his first foray back into Guantanamo, and as a person who represents men there, I'm desperate to see some change. So I'm trying to be optimistic. At the same time, I was concerned that the point of departure for the president seemed to be an initiative to re-engage with Congress, which since 2011 has been expressing its hostility towards his plan to close Guantanamo through the National Defense Authorization Act. I would have been more comforted if he had started by saying, I have a slate of prisoners that I'm going to begin working through the certification process with the Secretary of Defense. We know that the National Defense Authorization Act now grants him the latitude, the legislative framework, to begin releasing prisoners immediately. So I think the measure...
So they can hit him with drones. Release him and hit him with drones.
The measure of the speech will be what the president begins to do immediately. I mean, the urgency of the hunger strike is really the only reason we're talking about Guantanamo the way we are now. And that same urgency has to guide his actions. So I'm hopeful. The step on Yemen was critical. As someone who's pushed for lifting that moratorium for so long, it was remarkable to see how quickly it was lifted. But that has to be matched by immediately processing some of the Yemenis, men that I represent, Mohammed al-Hamiri, who's probably being force-fed as we speak. Those men need to start leaving the prison immediately. That would confirm for me that something's going to be different this time around.
Let's look at. I thought it was it was interesting how the president addressed specifically the topic of the hunger strike. I want to play that, and I want to talk about why it has taken him this long to get to it, and we'll do that after this.